Hey guys, welcome to the Wednesday wrap up with Z-Man and Ramsey Paul. It is March 12th and it's so good to have you guys here. Z-Man, we've been getting a lot of great response. People really love the show. And we do this every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central. We appreciate your involvement. And as always, I said, I split the super chat and revenue with Z-Man, pay him every month. And if you like the show, hey, just donate a few dollars. Think of it, you're like at a virtual cafe, buy a coffee for $5. We really do appreciate it. We have super chats on YouTube. Rumble has rants, and there's power chats right below. I already got some power chats before the show started, and we will get to it. And just so you guys know how I do this, and I've seen this in other streamers, it's kind of irritating when you're in a discussion, and then all of a sudden, whoa, $3, and then you stop everything. So we put that all at the end. And don't worry, in your rants, your power chats, and your super chats, I will get to them. So just put them out there, and Z-Man and I will discuss them at the end of the show, and we really do appreciate it. Tonight's topic is Reagan, Ronald Reagan. And it was interesting before the show, Z-Man and I were reminiscing real briefly of that was a great decade. Part of it was because I was in my youth. I graduated high school in 1981, graduated college in 1985. And the first president I ever voted for was Ronald Reagan in 1984 against Walter Mondale. And one of the big issues then was, is Reagan too old? He's just getting too old. He was 73 at the time. It's funny, Z-Man. When we look at Biden and even Trump, we thought 73 was too old to. That was a big issue. But to me, and I could be biased because I got my job in the corporate world, it was just, it just had a lot of energy in the 80s. And I think Reagan sort of typified that as president. He brought back the nice suits, the decorum. He had a little bit of gravitas you didn't really see with some of the other presidents, especially in Carter. And it reflected in the culture, and there's a lot of negatives. I mean, I think Reagan was a Hitler too. He was one of the literally Hitlers. The left hated him. But I would say, Z-Man, what are your thoughts? I would say in some ways, he's really defined what we think of modern conservatism. And let me back up a little bit for you youngsters out there. There used to be a thing called in the 1970s called Rockefeller Republicans. And they were like the Northeastern Republicans, named after Rockefeller, who was vice president, who were more moderates, that type of thing. And Reagan embodied what was the William F. Buckley, the National Review crowd, and a lot of his policies that we're going to talk about now, I would argue, Z-Man, have really shaped where we are now. And President Reagan was a huge president. I think he's going to go down in history. Love him or hate him, sort of like a Roosevelt or even a Lincoln. I think Trump will be in this category as someone that really changed the landscape. What are your thoughts about Reagan?
Yeah, it's funny in a way because when I think maybe it was we were talking about Nixon, and somebody suggested in the comments about doing a show on Reagan. It sounded like a good idea. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I don't think I've written anything about Reagan. So I went into my my site and I did a keyword search on Reagan, and everything came up was just tangential. It was actually about other things, throwaway references to Reagan. I have not written a single thing on Ronald Reagan. And I thought, I don't really think about Reagan that much. But yet when I was a young person, this guy loomed over everything. Mm-hmm. I mean, this guy people said, it was just assumed that when you're going to talk about the great presidents of the 20th century, it's FDR and Reagan.
Yeah.
And then if you're going to do the great presidents ever, you'll have FDR, Reagan, Lincoln, It was just assumed. And I started thinking about I've always just kind of assumed that, but you know what? Maybe not. Maybe I don't know. Maybe it's just time. You forget about these things, but maybe we will think. I mean, he did. I mean, that era changed everything. I mean, the aesthetic. I mean, that's a great example. I mean, we talked. I think I mentioned this before. The difference between a yearbook in 1978 and one in 1993.
Yeah, I lived through that. Yes, yeah.
I mean, in my prep school, the year before I got there, guys were allowed to wear jeans, sneakers, and all that stuff. The year I got there, you had jackets, ties, dress shoes, no jeans, slacks or trousers, And I mean, of course, the preppy look got in, So, like when we would go to parties, we all had short haircuts. We all were, I mean, no beards. I mean, it was, the only time we ever wear beards, we played sports, guys we'd grow beards for like, solidarity or something.
Yeah.
One year we actually grew mustaches because we heard that they were porn mustaches, but then we found out it was gay porn mustaches, so we all shaved them off, So, but still, being, I mean, like when I went to my senior dance, we all wore the exact same tuxedo. Because that word went out. This is how you were going to dress. It's an evening tuxedo. This is exactly how you're supposed to look for an evening affair. Our dates were told that they hats and gloves, all this stuff. I mean, it was a very different thing, and a lot of that had to do with Reagan. I mean, he was a classy guy. He had hung around with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, those old crooners who were, let's face it, I mean, they were classy men. They were guys who were men's men, but also good with the ladies. That mix of things. And so, and even after Reagan left the scene, his shadow was there with Bush 1, with Clinton, Bush 2. I mean, remember all the stuff Bush is, he's the boomer Reagan, which by that point I had become pretty disgruntled with politics. So when they started comparing Bush 2 to Reagan, and my blood pressure just, but I mean, I made it a point. I didn't have a television at the time when Reagan's funeral. I went somewhere so I could watch the funeral. I mean, that was an amazing event. I mean, and yet now, all these years later, I kind of wonder, because I think, a lot of the stuff that was started in the Reagan years turned out to be kind of bad stuff. Immigration, the massive military buildup that's turned into this out of control machine that just goes around wrecking stuff all over the world. The runaway corporate culture and the economic arrangements and stuff. I don't know if you can blame it on Reagan, but those things started then. And actually, young people I notice will bash Reagan. I say younger people, millennials and Zoomers. And I wince at it, but I think they might have a point. Maybe just because it was a good time for me when I was a young man. And look, it was a great time to be alive. I mean, the 80s were a fun time. It was fun because obviously we were at an age where you had adult freedom, but no adult responsibilities. That's always the best time,
Yeah.
But I mean, the economy was just fantastic. I mean, you could just get a job. It was great, And I had money in my pocket. I mean, I was a poor kid, and then all of a sudden, I'm in. I could get jobs and prep school and this, part-time jobs. And they say, we'll work around you. We'll work around your sports and all the other stuff, because it was just that desperate for people. So it was great. And
it was amazing. And you saw that in the 1984, it was such a landslide there. The theme was Morning in America, very effective commercial. Mondale didn't really have a chance. He barely won his home state because Reagan was just so popular at the time because of the economy. Taxes were lowered. He did deregulation. People had, right or wrong, he built up the military, but the people thought he had brought back respect for the military.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand this, a lot of younger people, but there was a time when I first went into high school, the late 70s, the being in the military was a real negative thing. The military had people had a negative view of the military, and especially like the FBI and CIA, which probably they were right. But Reagan kind of rehabilitated that all and said, you should be proud to be in the military, and we're the strongest nation. And he built back up the military, and we're standing up to the Soviets. And as we talked about last week with Nixon, it was interesting because Reagan really made his bones also being an anti-communist. He was in Hollywood, obviously he was an actor, and he was in charge of the Screen Actors Guild, I think it was. And one of the things he really was strong on at the time in the 50s and early 60s was rooting out the communist influence in Hollywood. And I think that always stayed with him. That was always a theme. That's hard to appreciate now because people don't think of communism now, but that was considered a defining moment. And I think we still have the remnants of this. So we're still under the shadow of Reagan, even what's happening now with Ukraine and Russia. A lot of the old conservatives still think it's 1985 and Russia's Soviet Union, they're the communist. It's ridiculous, but that's the shadow Reagan has really cast upon all our culture, I would say to this day.
Yeah, it's you see it in Trump. When he was planning to run for re-election, doing this was before COVID, a Morning in America campaign. You could see it all lining up. He was going to run Morning in America all over again, and now his dealings with the Russians. He's I don't think he's fantasizing about being Reagan, but you can tell he sees himself as in the same way dealing with the Russians, the bear. I wouldn't be shocked if we don't see that was an '84 commercial where the guy, you see a bear in the forest, some people say it's safe and some people say it's not, but isn't it a good idea to be safe? I mean, I forget what it was. It was a great commercial though. I mean, it was a fantastic commercial, and and I think Trump is certainly influenced by Reagan. Because I mean, look, you talk about a guy who was in his heyday in the '80s. I mean, that was Trump. I mean, supermodels, Ferraris, building buildings. I mean, he's on television, The Art of the Deal, and all this stuff. I mean, Trump. That was if you're going to pick a time in a person's life to live, 1980s Trump would have been. That was a good time, and so I do think that, and I think it's one of those things. There's so much that happened in that time that just became a part of the normal. What is normal? That we don't really think about it that much. And I think, that was one of the things I was batting around in my head is, I don't talk about Reagan, but is it just because all this, what had happened then was wild and it was crazy and it seemed exciting, but now it's just normal.
Right.
The idea of tax rates at 78%, that's just so insane. I mean, it's almost inconceivable that it existed. But it did. I mean, granted, you had all these crazy deductions and all that stuff. But I mean, I'm old enough to remember, and so are you, when there was one phone company. I mean,
yes, Ma Bell, it was that was it. And Reagan, again, a lot of what we consider Republican or conservative, Reagan defined for good or ill. And I think Trump is maybe starting to redefine this a little bit. But deregulation, that was a big thing with Reagan. Cutting taxes dramatically. At the time, it was referred to as Reaganomics. In fact, that became a word. And the left hated it because they said, he has this trickle-down theory. But, in some ways it worked. You cut the taxes and it actually increased revenues. However, one of the things that Reagan always regretted is he was never able to balance the budget, and the deficit continued to grow. And no one's been able to fix that. We have a crisis now with it. But he set the stage for what a Republican economic policy is. It's standard now. Just like Trump has fundamentally, I think, changed the Republican Party. I don't think people appreciate how much Reagan really changed the Republican Party from what it was under Eisenhower, then Nixon, and Ford. Reagan was considered really quite extreme by people at the time.
He was Hitler.
He was. They said it was. I was told if Reagan, once he was elected president, we're going to have World War III, and because he was just crazy. But we never had that. But that
remember
was
the film The Day After.
That was propaganda against Reagan. He's going to, and all the kids are crying. That was sort of a psyop they did even back then. It was ridiculous. So I think he's been profound in that way. And we see it in the economy, how we go forward. He sort of really discredited, or we don't even hardly talk seriously about socialism anymore, or obviously not communism, but even socialism. And that was popular in the 60s and 70s. And Reagan just somehow just eliminated that from the American psyche almost. I mean, you still have some holdouts like Bernie Sanders, and it may come back. But it was a fundamental change. And the point is, and there's people in our circles, and I agree with it, they look back at Reagan saying that, he was actually bad. In some ways, that was true, like the 1986 Amnesty Act, where the illegals, he gave them amnesty. Of course, in defense for him, he thought they would implement policies to prevent more illegal immigration. Obviously, that didn't happen. What are your thoughts on Reagan when it came to the cultural issues? He kind of, people would say, cucked on the immigration issue. And he had the war on drugs. You remember Nancy Reagan just say no. That was a big thing. What's your take on that?
Yeah, Reagan, it is a fascinating guy. It's funny because, this week, realizing that I hadn't really thought much about Reagan in any detail, I went to the Wikipedia page and I watched the Reagan movie.
Oh, yeah. Do you like it?
That was it was not what I expected. Honestly, I didn't watch it at all because I just figured it was going to be making fun of the 80s and Reagan and white people and stuff, But it was completely different. I got the setup of it and all that. I was so knocked off my off balance because I didn't expect it to be like that. That it took me a little while to kind of get into the movie, but then I realized whatever the actor's name is was playing Reagan. What an amazing job that guy did.
He did. Right? He did seem like Reagan.
I had to go, I forget his name, but I looked him up. I'm like, wait a second. I now remember this guy in films. He's not like this. This is really kind of wild how good he was at it. And, but it was a little sappy. I mean, it was, I think, what's the word they use? Hagiography, it was, talking about Reagan as if he was this singular creature, this, he was, God called him to defeat communism. I don't know about that. I mean, that's a lot of Hollywood stuff. But that is really, and as I was going to circle back to where I started, something that it dawned on me. It's like, you know what? I complain all the time that our politicians are nothing more than actors. The system, they just hire these guys to be frontmen. But the guy who really perfected that in a lot of ways was Reagan. He was, he wasn't a great actor. He was, a studio trained actor, and he was competent. Mm-hmm. But where he really became great was these GE shows he did, where he would do these TV shows. But the other thing he did is he went and did in-person appearances to the company employees as a motivational speaker. Mm-hmm. And he had to learn how to do this. He had to learn how to stand up and get people excited about, hey, we're changing the form we use for reporting your hours, and this is going to save the company, that kind of stuff. And he got really very good at this. He mastered a medium in the kind of realm of persuasiveness that translated really well to politics. And he became, and that political skill or that media skill changed our politics completely, because people forget that. I mean, sure, television was important, but all these guys look like dorks. I mean, Mike Dukakis ran in '88, and Mondale, and Carter, and Ford. I mean, and these are some boring dudes, man. I mean, I look scintillating on camera compared to what the guys were to that point, And these guys, and all of a sudden Reagan comes along and he knows where the cameras are. He knows how to tilt his head and change his inflection of his own voice. And, that head tilt thing, that was that signal that always told the audience something's coming. He had trained his audience, it was really remarkable. And the Clintons in '92, they hired all these Hollywood people. They produced all the Clinton film, The Boy from Hope, and all this stuff. I mean, and ever since then, ever since Reagan, our politics have been Hollywood. I mean, Newt Gingrich complained about Washington being Hollywood for ugly people. I mean, and because it's true, it's what it is. And that really was a tremendous innovation. And I don't think it was necessarily, it wasn't scripted. Reagan really liked to perform in front of people. He just genuinely enjoyed it. He enjoyed the to and fro and the back and forth. And people forget that Reagan wrote his own speeches. So when he gave those speeches, especially in front of a crowd, he would adjust what he was saying based on reading the audience, like a good comedian. A good comedian kind of figures out, hey, the crowd's sober, I can't tell this joke. Oh, wait a second, the crowd's been drinking, I can tell this joke, then they'll laugh at it. Reagan was good like that. In a lot of ways, Trump is very similar. You watch Trump give a speech, if the crowd kind of groans on something that he does, well, he changes his mind. Another someone part of the speech will say the opposite thing, and then the crowd cheers. And so Reagan really he changed our politics. He altered how we think about politics. It went from being these kind of dull guys who talk about policy and to a guy who talked about bigger pictures, because that was the thing about Reagan. And I forgot about this until I watched the film. And honestly, I was a little sappy because I guess I'm old and cynical now. But as a kid, man, I'd watch a Reagan speech and I'm thinking, you know what? I'm going to be better tomorrow. I mean, he was an inspiring person.
Yeah. Yeah, and Sasha just texted me. It was Dennis Quaid was the actor. Dennis Quaid. He did a great job on that movie, and it wasn't an anti. It was kind of a pro Reagan movie, really. It didn't get. By the way, it's just an aside. It wasn't up for any nominations for the Academy Awards because of DEI problems. Literally, that was the reason.
That's right. Well, isn't Dennis Quaid the guy who was in Independence Day who flew the ship into the?
I think so. Yeah, he did a great job on that. So yeah, but you're right about Reagan being like the first, and that was a criticism at the time. Like, oh, he's just an actor. How can we have an actor, or as you would say, a carny in that position? Yeah. But he did that very well. And if you think back to the prior presidents. I mean, before him, there was Jimmy Carter was not very charismatic in front of the camera. Then Gerald Ford is forgettable. Nixon was uncomfortable really in front of the camera. LBJ wasn't very good at it. Kennedy was too brief. And Eisenhower, that was, we're going way back now, but none of them had that. Reagan was the first one is like, wait a minute, if I'm going to promote something, I got to get that emotional appeal like you have in a movie. And I often thought of that, like now it's just standard, like at the State of the Union address, they will have, Trump had that, the black boy with brain cancer. I mean, it's a sad story, but it's inspiring. There's always something like that. And Reagan really introduced that. He was really good at understanding, getting to the individual and getting the emotions behind things. And from a purist point of view, I mean, it shouldn't be that way, right? You should just talk about logic and facts, but people care about feelings and feel good. And Reagan really changed our politics that now both sides do it all the time.
Yeah, it's funny. As I was, I'm thinking about all this stuff, but like when the Challenger exploded.
Yes.
I remember I know exactly where I was. I was with this girl I was dating. And Reagan came on. Reagan gave this statement on the radio.
Yes,
I guess whatever it was, and she started crying.
Mm-hmm.
And because it wasn't because she was sad. It was because it was such a beautiful thing to say. And that was a remarkable thing about Reagan is that in difficult times he had this very interesting way of kind of bucking you up. It wasn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and it was. It kind of just lets you think about better times. It was hard to explain, all the difficult things that happened in the 80s, especially like dealing with the Russians. And he would have this kind of funny way of being able to address it in a way you think, well, we have to pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and move forward. That's just how it was. And it was a very gifted man in that way. And I think, the one thing that the movie overdid, I think, is this. He was a man of destiny, and he was there to, he had this nature of protecting people and saving people and all that. I think they overdid it a little bit, but I do think that was a big part of it. I think when he looked at himself as president, I hate to say this, but he kind of looked as he was the nation's father, that he had a sort of a duty to speak harsh truth sometimes, but at the same time, be the tender sort of guy that said, well, you know what, everybody makes mistakes, let's move on. And it really was he defined the presidency in that way. He really kind of, everybody's tried to be this. Clinton tried to be like him. Bush obviously tried to be like, they tried to make Bush into Reagan, which I think part of the reason why I hated George Bush at the time is they kept comparing him to Reagan. I remember wanting to reach through the television and strangle these people. Karl Rove was the guy who would do that. But certainly Obama was completely scripted. I mean, they wanted to make him into Black Reagan. I mean, that's really what they thought he was, So, and I think it came natural for Reagan. I don't think he was a faker. I think he was the real deal. He's another guy, like we talked last week about Nixon. Nixon being sort of this kind of odd American. He's this, you don't get a Nixon anywhere else. That's America produces Nixon. America produces Reagan. We there's no getting around that. Reagan is definitely quintessential American. You don't get a French Reagan or a German Reagan. Well, maybe you got a German Reagan, but they're not allowed to talk about that anymore. But But you get the idea.
Yeah. Do you think we've strayed away from the seriousness that Reagan had, even though he was good with the camera and compassionate, and he could be quite witty? At the same time, we've almost become a little bit clownish with our presidents. Like it started, I think, with Clinton, and I like Trump, but Trump is not exactly the gravitas all the time. Whereas Reagan, you always felt that he acted the role as the president should. And maybe that's just a misconception because I know behind the scenes LBJ had a foul language, but you have this idea of someone trying to be dignified. They can be relatable, but still dignified. And it seems like our whole culture, maybe it started with Clinton, I think, has got really degraded and kind of coarse. And I miss the classiness that Reagan had. And I think that's sort of important. Or is that a weakness? Is it good to have someone like Trump that just really shakes everything up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question because I think I'm kind of I'm a hierarchy guy. I
Hmm.
think one of the things I learned in my life is that because I grew up very poor, and most of the people around me they're poor because they don't have what it takes to not be poor. They make bad
Right.
decisions, they're not smart or whatever. And I'm in this outlier, so I go out of that world into the middle class world, and one of the things I realize is that there's a duty that people who have some ability have to those who don't, and
Hmm.
it should be back and forth. There should be respect for people who are accomplished and do things and are leaders, and at the same time, the people at the top looking down have this duty. It's the way things ought to be. And in a lot of ways, Reagan was that guy. I mean, this was a guy who set the standard aesthetically. When there was a
Hmm.
big White House event, he would dance with his wife. He said, "This is how men are going to be." It was a lot like how the king would act, which is what I want. I mean, that's the way it's
Yeah,
supposed
I
to be.
remember. I'll let you continue, but if I could interject, he's the one that he demanded a dress code that if you're in the White House, you wear a suit and tie. If you're a man,
Right.
you don't show up, half-ass.
Like a
And
little green outfit.
yeah, exactly. Even Trump pushed back a little bit, but Reagan, he was very serious about that, and they tried to make it a lot more classy because it kind of got a little shabby, and he understood that was important. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think Trump tries to do this, but Trump's a guy from Queens, man. He's,
Yeah,
he,
he's a salesman a little bit, he's selling Teslas or I
it's
can't
just,
imagine, like, do you see Trump? He put out a True Social, like, oh, The Apprentice is coming back out. Make sure you watch that. Your favorite, and I can't imagine Reagan pumping something like that, as the
I,
president.
I'm pretty sure that we're going to see Teslas on the lawn and that inflatable wacky guy up on the front lawn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Where are you now? It's at the White House. Really? Yeah, bought a Tesla.
Yeah.
You got great financing. You can see the Treasury Secretary. He's the guy doing the business work. What's your credit rating? 785. Well, we can do 5.2% interest. But anyway, yeah. I mean, the thing about it, but that it was. I mean, I think Trump tries to do this. I think he does, but I just don't think he understands. I think Reagan somehow or other he understood that, which is strange because he wasn't a rich guy growing up or anything like that. He
No.
was pretty modest, and but he just had a sense about it. I think because that was one of the things. He wasn't a great actor, but people respected him. When he ran for governor in California, he had all the support of all these Hollywood people, which is kind of remarkable in a way. And of course, when he was president, all these Hollywood people really they might not disagree with him, but they respected him.
Hmm.
And I think it really says something though about it's important how you carry yourself. It's
Hmm.
important how you dignity is a thing you give yourself. It's not all these people in this age who say especially like men in dresses you have to give me the dignity I deserve. No, if you're a man in a dress, you forfeit your dignity. I'm
Right.
sorry.
Obviously. Yeah. Yeah.
Dignity is the thing you give yourself, and I think in a way, the everybody took the wrong lessons in politics from Reagan. Yeah, he used his Hollywood skills and his understanding about how to work a crowd that he developed as a pitchman and all this stuff, but that wasn't why he won and why it was successful. There was something else there. The man had real genuine qualities, and and instead they just keep hiring these carnies and say, well, here's the role you have to play, and then they find a guy who does it and he plays it. I mean, I think the ultimate carny was Obama. I mean, Obama. I mean, he had no backstory. I mean, his resume was could have been written on a napkin. If he had a LinkedIn account, it would just have like one line, and it'd be all blank at the bottom. And but he was a guy who was hired to play a role. He was coached on it. I mean, it was clear that they were doing this stuff, and so it's kind of I don't know, it's like a double-edged sword in a way. I respect who Reagan was and what he did, but at the same time, he kind of laid all these seeds for a lot of bad stuff. I mean, immigration is a perfectly good example. The financialization of the economy, the militarism. I think also this kind of toxic individualism too. That kind of came out of that area. And look, I used to buy into that. When I was an '80s guy, I would say, I'm on my own. I take care of myself, and screw everybody else. It was only until I got older and more mature I realized how foolish that was. But there's a lot of old guys who still think this way. I mean, there's a lot of boomers who have that sort of conservative Reagan, rugged individualism attitude.
Yeah, that was the whole Wall Street era. Greed is good. And Reagan, he was kind of the symbol of that. My question for you, and this is an interesting thought experiment. If Reagan was alive today, and let's say obviously he wasn't to have Alzheimer's, so this is a big what if, what would he think of Trump? Would he support him or not?
That's a really good question, isn't it? Because, I mean, Trump is really more analogous in my mind to Bill Clinton. And I think Reagan probably would have looked at Bill Clinton as a lowlife.
Yes, he would. He was a lowlife, by the way, I could tell you, but yeah.
Yeah, and he wouldn't have any respect for him. And I don't know. That's a tough one, because I think, unlike Bill Clinton, Trump is accomplished in his private life. He built buildings, and he's successful. I mean, let's face it, it's really hard to be good at commercial real estate in a place like New York. So
right.
I don't know. That's a really good question, because I think policy-wise, he would be confused by Trump. See, I think a lot of these conservative guys, they didn't really understand that what they were contending with. They thought they could. This has always been this problem of conservatives they had, that, geez, if we just fix the tax code, if we just change this, we change the rules in some ways, these bad people who want to undermine and subvert the country, they'll be contained by the rules, and we won't have to personally do it. We won't have to personally confront them. It's always been the conservative idea, and libertarians are like the worst at this too, is that, oh, well, hey, all we got to do is we tinker around with the rules in such a way, and then you can't be a radical. If we get rid of the welfare state, you can't be a radical. You get rid of the tax code, you can't be a radical. And they never appreciate the fact that the radicals will find some way to be a radical. Even if they have to start shooting people, they will do that. And I think Trump gets that. I mean, I think Trump understands that in the end, power is power. I mean, I think that's what the lesson he learned over the last 8 years was, that when you have political power, you better use it, and you better punish your enemies. I mean, look, he pulled the security clearances of Perkins Coie, which will probably put that law firm out of business. That's probably $1 billion law firm he's going to put out of business. I don't think Reagan is the guy who would do that. And Reagan wouldn't understand that.
Right. And I think Reagan, getting back to his personality, maybe one of the reasons I like him, because I'm old now, but he reminds me of my grandfather a little bit. He comes from like that era that those people are all dead now. But they were... they're a type of man we don't see as much anymore, where they were very tough men. They could be very strong, but they were always dignified. They weren't thugs. They carried themselves in that way, in a civilized way, but they were never weak. They would never back down. My grandfather would confront people, but at the same time, he never acted like a thug. And I really like that about Reagan. He was pretty classy that way. And I'm wondering if some of the success of Reagan, the conservatives and the Republicans until Trump learned the wrong lesson, because it sort of worked for Reagan. We had a good economy. Everyone was happy in the 80s. The Soviet Union fell apart, and Reagan got a lot of credit for it. It's probably too much credit, to be honest. Just like he got credit for inflation, is probably Paul Volcker more than anyone. Yeah. But nevertheless, if you're in charge, you get the credit for the good or bad. And I think they learned that he so transformed the party again because the party was way different before Reagan. Reagan was considered too extreme. You had more of the Rockefeller Republicans, and then Reagan transformed the party, and now all the minions that still remember Reagan, they're principled Reagan conservatives, and I look at someone like a Mike Pence or something that probably would have loved Reagan, and but he doesn't understand. Sometimes you have to adapt to the times because things change, and sometimes you need more of a Teddy Roosevelt fighter or a Jackson or a Trump than you need a Reagan. While I think Reagan was very valuable, I think we always joke, and I see you do this too, like the left, is perpetually either 1938 or 1968. But for a lot of Republicans, I got to be honest, it's perpetually 1985. And part of
Yeah.
that's because of Reagan.
Yeah, that's one of those things when I see anybody say reference Reagan, and I guess, kind of where I started is that, I don't talk about Reagan anymore. And it's a shame in a way because there is a lot of good things as we're kind of fleshing out here. There's a lot of really good things. I mean, the way a man carried himself. I mean, Reagan was a normal guy who lived a bit of a charmed life, got very successful, and appreciated that. He had a humility to him. All of our other politicians are weirdos who fell into these great opportunities, and then they're trying to pretend to be normal, and it's completely different. You remember Reagan used to go on vacation out to California, and he would chop down trees, and
Yeah.
I mean, because he actually liked it. He enjoyed doing that kind of stuff. But I think that I kind of lost our track of what we were talking about here. What you started.
Well, just about how Reagan really influenced modern day Republicans so much so that they can't really change their direction because it worked for Reagan, and we got to be principled conservatives. And Trump is like a bull in a china shop, and he's vindictive, whereas Reagan never seemed vindictive. He would smile at you while he's criticizing you.
Well, you know what? That goes back to that wrong. Now, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But your point about learning the wrong lesson.
Yeah.
What these guys came away with and said, okay, Reagan did all these things. These are safe. I can talk about these things without the left getting mad at me. Mm-hmm. Because to be a conservative is to be a complete pussy. I mean, let's not get ourselves. I mean, that's really what it's about. And these are they're just kept men. And that's the lesson they drew from Reagan. Oh, you get to say these things. But before Reagan, you weren't allowed to say these things. Reagan actually managed to make the word liberal. Remember in the 70s, they all called themselves liberals. He turned it into where even the liberals were ashamed to call themselves liberals. They all became moderates. I'm not a liberal, I'm a moderate. And I knew this because I worked for a congressman. His name was Congressman Long. And he, I'm just a kid working a part-time job, and running errands and stuff. And if you said he was a liberal, he would get angry. I mean, you did not use that word. I mean, and he was literally a liberal. I mean, that's what he was. And I mean, that's amazing. Reagan anathematized an entire decade of the 1970s and a pretty big chunk of the 1960s. We all of a sudden we went to glorifying the Woodstock generation and disco and all this stuff. And then within a few years, people were making fun of that. Boomers were taking those pictures and hiding them away so their kids wouldn't find them. I mean, all of a sudden, it really changed the attitude about things, and it's a good example that people can change their minds. You can persuade them. You just one of the other mistakes that I think conservatives took away is that we always have to chase the market. We have to find out. Okay, there's a majority who believe this, so now conservatism will be this. No. You define whatever it is you're doing, and you persuade people to come to it. And to Trump's credit, he has actually done that. Mm-hmm. Not always very good, but he's done
it. One of my favorite Russian authors, Tolstoy, he often argued, is it really the man that changes things, or is it the change that develops the man? And that's kind of an interesting point with Reagan. Did he really do all these changes, or was he just the product of the forces that were already in play?
Yeah, that's one of those great questions. Cometh the hour, cometh the man, and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably a little both. America's a funny place. We produce a lot of weirdos, You know,
Yeah.
I mean, like we really do, and because we're a big country, we got a lot of room, we got a lot of space. I mean, we're a lightly populated country too. You know, you don't appreciate how much elbow room we have until you go to Europe, and then everybody's packed in and on top of each other. So I think it's probably a part of their conformity. But America, we produce a lot of weirdos. But you know what? Every once in a while, one of these weirdos turns out to be the right man at the right time.
Hmm.
And I think, so it's kind of a quintessentially American thing. All of a sudden, events kind of came together, and then Reagan is there. Because people forget, Reagan ran in 68. He actually
Yes.
was in the ballot, and he got the delegates from California. He was thinking that there might be a brokered convention in 68, and he could be a kingmaker, or maybe even get the nomination. And then he ran in 76.
Yeah.
And
Lost to
everybody,
Ford.
yeah, and there's a great. I think it's a great story. This is one of those things. It's unbelievable today, but the conventions were on all day long. They just put cameras up, and you watch the conventions on. But my parents watched it. They weren't political, but they would watch the conventions in the evening because they did the, Mr. Chairman, the great state of Alabama, and the guy would give this
Right.
speech about what's wonderful about Alabama. My parents thought that was fantastic, and I remember lots of other kids' parents watched this too because it was a different age, But I remember that 76 convention because my father, I remember him to this day sitting on the couch and saying, that man's going to be president one day. When he pointed at Reagan, everybody just knew. They just knew he was guy. And then 1980 and then 84. But so in a lot of ways, timing is everything. It would have been much better off for the world. It was much better off for the world that Reagan didn't win in 68. He didn't win in 76, that he won in 80 because it was the right time. The country was ready for Reagan.
Yeah, I think you are. And going back to a subject you've talked about quite a bit, and I have mixed feelings. This is a disclaimer. I've always loved politics. I was kind of geeky this way as a kid. I literally was reading National Review in the 70s, right? With Sobran, William F. Buckley Jr., all those guys. And I thought it was a great magazine back then. But National Review was sort of the conservative magazine back then that had a lot of influence. And they were a big Reagan fan. And they really helped to shape that from what we'd call the Rockefeller Republicans or the others. And it's sort of how National Review has morphed and they became neocons. They did the big purge and now they're just a joke. No one really reads it. But it's almost kind of mirrors what sort of happened with the whole Reagan Revolution, it was called. Yeah, William F. Buckley Jr. was close friends with Ronald Reagan, and they were so ecstatic when Reagan won. I remember National Review said, like, we did it or we won on their headline. They couldn't believe it. And it just seemed like in the golden age, and it was. But then after Reagan went, the whole conservative movement, they again just became stuck in, when you think of like a basic bitch conservative now, it's, oh, we got to cut taxes or deregulate, which it's not necessarily bad, but they don't understand the other pressing issues anymore, and they've become really disconnected. And did you see that arc too? What happened with the conservative movement?
Yeah, I started. This is a terrible idea of mine, but I started trying calling conservatives. They're just slow progressives. They want all the same stuff. They have that same sort of egalitarian democratic mindset, and as a result, they just can't appreciate leadership. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that all these guys writing for conservative publications never had a damn job in their life, so they don't know what the hell how the world works. I've become increasingly resentful of people who haven't worked, but come on. I mean, you probably have learned more about the human condition in your work career, having to manage people, manage your boss, all that stuff, and you understand
customers,
yeah. I mean, it's just basic stuff, and yet you have all these guys who've got 8 degrees who are going to tell me how the economy works. I'm sorry, I'm not interested. But I think a lot of these conservatives, they're all these sort of soft men who got the right diploma and wound up in writing for a living, and they couldn't appreciate what the reality of Reagan was, which was this man was a leader.
Yes.
Men wanted to, he was a great example of the old line, was it first-rate men hire first-rate men, second-rate men hire third-rate men? Well, Reagan was a first-rate man. He surrounded himself with first-rate men. Bill Buckley, and if you know Peter Brimelow, he's written about this. Bill Buckley was really a second-rate man. He always liked having, guys around him that he could feel superior to. And that was conservatism. Conservatism is a world of second-rate men, and then third-rate men, and fourth-rate men, and fifth-rate men. And as a result, they just find all these safe things, and they try to attach it to Reagan, and, they go whichever way the wind blows. Can you imagine Reagan reading National Review when they did the conservative case for transgenderism?
Yeah, no. That's why I'm saying I think they really lost their mooring. And William F. Buckley Jr. back in the 70s, I guess how he stood out, because back then, Republicans and conservatives, they were considered, they were made fun of as just being stupid, low IQ. If you remember the TV show MASH, remember that? It went on too long. But Frank Burns was like the typical conservative, just real dumb. And William F. Buckley, he was a Yale graduate. He was kind of pretentious, and he had his Yale background, and he would have firing line. And he was from New York City, so it kind of broke some of that mold, and it gave it some sophistication. Which I guess was okay at the time. But I think the problem is they all hung on to Reagan, but Reagan in many ways had more in common with Trump than he did with them, because they're just hangers on, whereas Reagan was a real leader. The same with Trump, good or bad. And so I would like to think if Reagan was still alive, this is a thought experiment, that he would have changed, and he would have been more like in the Trump camp right now and been against a lot of this woke stuff. And again, they didn't really have what we called woke back then, but it was communist, and he was very anti-communist. He put down the Berkeley protesters in California. And you remember, well, just recently we're hearing all this Doge stuff. Remember the air traffic controllers? He fired them.
Yeah,
and
ATCO,
that was a big to do, and he did that, and it was controversial. So Reagan, he did some very unpopular things, and he would stand by that. Whereas like the conservatives, they just kind of latched onto him. And then when he went away, I don't think there was anyone ever took the place, really. They were always looking for the next Reagan, but it never really happened. And then finally we have a Donald Trump that doesn't really give a damn about trying to perpetuate that, whereas someone like Mike Pence, or even the guy we used to have here in Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, they would always try to recreate what Reagan was, but they're nowhere the same type of man as he was, so they kind of miss the point.
Yeah, you got Tom Cotton too, right? He's your senator?
Allegedly, I don't know if he's ever been to Arkansas. I think you would think he's from Israel based on his tweets, but yeah,
well,
he's
Tucker Carlson has alluded to the fact, that Tom Cotton is blocking the Epstein release and something else.
Interesting.
Because it embarrasses Israel. And he hasn't said it explicitly, but he's kind of hinting around at it. So, Arkansas is becoming like South Carolina, lots of bad politicians.
Well, Tom Cotton is, I looked it up. We have less than 6,000 Jews in the whole state. But all he talks about is Jewish interests. It's really bizarre. This guy, you've talked about it, how we have politicians don't really represent the people where they're from. In fact, he probably doesn't even like Arkansas. Ooh, gross. I live in Washington, D.C. area. And so, and I think getting back to how this ties to Reagan, though, would you say Reagan, I know you wrote a lot about populism. You could say that Reagan was a populist in many ways.
Yeah, he was. Reagan, all the stuff about, a little guy here, all the stuff about, Reaganomics. Reagan loved tariffs. People forget this. He tariffed the crap out of the Japanese to try and protect American steel, American automakers. He certainly appealed to the average person. Reagan was a great flatterer in a lot of ways. That's always a good thing about, populists always do that. They flatter the audience, as somebody mentioned in my comments, and it's turned up in other places now, is that, elites in waiting or a temporarily embarrassed elite, the phrase is temporarily embarrassed millionaires, that's Reagan kind of appealed to that, hey, you might be a guy working in a plant right now. one day you could be rich. You could look like me and have a cool looking tuxedo and be a sophisticated guy. You just, just vote for me, And I mean, that's very populist in that way. I mean, Trump to a great degree does that when he goes into, a fast food joint. I mean, one of the things that people always miss is that when he walks into a fast food joint or a retail place, everybody loves him.
Yeah. Did you remember? Did you ever see that when Joe Biden tried to do that? And the guy was trying to look away. It's so funny. He's the president of the United States. The guy's like, yeah, don't make eye contact. We don't want to come over here.
I mean, when Trump was in that McDonald's, I mean, all the kids in there, they're like, this is so cool.
Yeah, I know.
And of course, Trump, that his entire life he's thinking it would be really cool to work the fry machine.
Yeah.
And and I mean, again, I think there's that that common touch that people have, or they don't have it. It's kind of an odd thing. I've known people who are, came from humble beginnings, but they have sort of that. I don't know. There's something about them. They just don't have the common touch. I mean, I've never had common touch either, so I suppose it's true. But so it's something I recognize myself. But then I've known people who have come from. One of my oldest friends, trust funder. You get him around average people, and everybody loves him. He's just one of these kind of guys. He just has a way about him. So I think Reagan, maybe how he was raised, or who knows, but he certainly had that sense of it. And as a result, his sort of populist appeal just went over really well. It was really hard to hate Reagan. You remember back then, even though they tried calling him Hitler and stuff, I mean, the people calling him Hitler would laugh at themselves calling him Hitler. I mean, it was just so silly.
Yeah, he had that. He was never really threatening. He always just kind of laughed at his detractors. And even Mondale laughed at his quip about how he wouldn't hold his inexperience against him.
The debate was over. Yeah,
it was. Yeah, because Reagan just had a way about him that was, whereas Trump's a little bit more aggressive and gets angry. Hey, we'll take some. We got a bunch of super chats, and then we'll wrap up. But thank you guys. So if you have questions, get them in right now. We're going to go through them. And I want to start with Pam Hyde on Rumble, $10. How much of Reagan's success was due to optimism versus policy? I'm like having Trump back, but looking at the wider picture, it looks like we're going to have 10 to 15 years of hard times coming. All I would have to say about it's hard to predict the future, believe me, because I'm having flashbacks. When I graduated high school in 1981, I just remember everyone was so pessimistic about, Reagan's going to get us into World War III. Everything's going to crash. The 80s are going to be a dark time. I remember that clearly. Turned out to be a great decade. So you never quite know. I'm not really quite sure about that. But I will say, I think the two are interrelated. People like a positive agenda, and this is just not president. I would say this is just in real life, just how you interact with people. If you're the person that's just always bitching about how everything sucks and there's no hope, and that group, they control everything and there's nothing we can do, and those types, it eventually just, I don't know, people eventually get tired of that, right? People want to have a vision that I know Trump's trying to do that with the golden age, and Reagan really definitely had that. And that was a huge change from Jimmy Carter and his famous Malaise speech that America's going to shit and everything, basically. And then Reagan had this positive attitude about him. And I'm not one saying that you could just have a positive attitude and nothing else. But I think you want a leader that has a vision that is positive, that you can see yourself going forward in. And that's something even the recent elections, Kamala Harris, there was no positive vision. It was just how bad Trump is. And it was all this weird stuff. There was nothing that would excite the average person. So I do think the optimism that Reagan had, and he was famous for that. Thank you for bringing that up, Pam. Was a beneficial thing. What did you think about the whole optimism thing that Reagan was known for?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember the whole happy warrior business, and I was too young to really appreciate it. But early in my work career, I had a great boss who said, look, men follow men. and everyone will follow you and do what you want, and they will figure out what you want before you know it, as long as you enthusiastically embrace whatever it is you're asked to do.
Mm-hmm.
They'll follow you. And times I haven't done that, I regretted it, but times I have, I found out, yeah, exactly true. People will, hey, this guy believes it, I'm with him. I'll go and follow him, and that's just human nature, And Reagan understood that. I mean, he was a guy. See, there's a good example of actually having real world experience. He had to lead a union. He had to convince people, and he actually had to run an organization. He actually had to do a real job, and as a result, he figured it out. Hey, you know what? People will follow me if I believe in what I'm doing. Well, then if he believes it and he's a good guy and I trust him, well, I'll follow him. And I think Trump has a little bit of that, but he's just I don't know. He's not a happy warrior, Trump.
No.
Trump is more of a gangster. I mean, there's definitely a different personality.
We got a super chat from Carl 9X. Thank you. $20. Reagan on TV is one of my first memories. Yeah. I don't know if he's my first memory, but I only knew of Reagan when as a politician. He was before my time. I guess he hosted General Electric show, something like that in the early 60s. That was before I was born, basically, or I was real little. And I remember his movies. Did he do like Bedtime for Gonzo or Bonzo or something like that with a chimp? He was never a super famous actor, but he wasn't really horrible. He was kind of more B movies. And but I never really knew him in his acting days or his television time outside of politics.
His best leading man years were during the war, and he did all these training films. He was actually in the service, and apparently, I mean, he actually wanted to, he volunteered. He wasn't, drafted, and there was that weird window for leading men in Hollywood at the time, and that 5 or 6 years was like his prime years. So he just kind of missed it, and I think if I recall, part of the lure of Reagan was that his agent said to him, look, you got a couple of years left to be a good looking man that people want to see on television. You should find something else to do.
Yeah.
And then it wound up, the guy spent their entire life on television,
Yeah. He went through a down part, and it showed that in the Reagan movie where he ended up like a pitch man because it's hard for him to get roles in Hollywood anymore. And that was kind of a low part of his life, so he had to make a change.
But it was the best thing for him. It taught that was the best training for him to be a politician.
Yeah, definitely. And I got another super chat, unrelated to Reagan. Z-Man had a show dedicated to Russia. I just wanted to say it was refreshing, and I appreciate the positive sentiment. Yeah, Z-Man has a lot of great shows and podcasts he does. I encourage you to listen to it every Friday. He has one.
I always appreciate the compliments. I do these. I get these crazy ideas in my head when I do these shows, and when you're a one-man band, and this, you do one-man videos and stuff. There's a lot of times you think, man, what the hell am I doing? This is awful. And usually those turn out to be the most popular shows. The ones I think, man, this is great. People are like, it's not that great.
Yeah, that happens with my videos. Were that way. Sometimes I do a throwaway video, go viral, or even on Twitter or X, I had some tweets that had gone viral that I just put out at a spur of the moment, no thought in it, and just catches fire. It's really weird. Sasha texted me, Reagan was in Dark Victory with Betty Davis in the 1930s that won awards. I didn't know he acted that long ago in the 1930s with Betty Davis. So,
right. Well, Jesus, Betty Davis. Well, yeah, actually, she wasn't that old. She was alive in my lifetime, I think.
Yeah, she actually went to the White House. She was a Democrat, but she liked Reagan on a personal basis because he had that quality. Even Democrats kind of liked him.
Wasn't she the woman who used to torture her children? Is that her?
No, that was Joan Crawford. She had like a legendary. Joan Crawford was her rival. They hated each other in real life, and they're about the same age, and that's the whole story there. But that was kind of funny. They were like of the golden age of Hollywood, and Reagan was never like a huge star, but again, he was more than just a character actor. He was a decent actor. That was that. All right, I got some power chats, and if you guys have more, keep them coming in. I really do appreciate it. Tony, this is the power chat. Was one Reagan issue that he was too far right economically and not socially? He signed the 1986 amnesty and never secured the border, and he really emboldened the oligarchs to mass wealth. Now we see how much of those rich push open borders. Well, in hindsight, probably, and this is where Trump, I think, is straightening things out. But I would tell you from living through that era of the 70s, super high taxation rates, super high regulation. I would almost say Reagan almost had a libertarian bent to him a little bit when it came to economics of like, hey, let's just really cut taxes dramatically. Let's get the government out of your business and businesses. He was big on that. Small government never really happened, but that was his message. And it was hard to argue at the time because it really made a boom decade in the 1980s. And 1986, I'm not trying to defend him too much, but at the time, the 1986 amnesty was sold like, okay, they're already here. Let's just give them amnesty. But we promise from now on, we're not going to be able to hire any illegal aliens and we're going to stop the whole flow. So he kind of compromised on that, which should be a lesson. You should never believe the Democrats. What did you think he was too far right economically?
No, I mean it was the right antidote at the time, And look, I think by and large, I don't want the government too involved in the regulation of business. What I want government to do is kind of set this tone, this
right
in terms of economics. What we're doing needs to be not just good for me personally, but allow me to be a contributor to my culture, my society. Look, it's a weird thing. Someone mentioned Russia earlier. This is exactly how Russia does things now. They evaluate businesses saying, how is this contributing to Russian culture, the Russian people? Is it making us stronger? Is this good for us culturally? I mean, that really is the way you have to look at it, I think. And but ultimately, that's a very general framework. But it's terms of who buys what and all that stuff. No, I don't. I mean, it's crazy to have the government involved in these things, especially since our government is populated by people who can't make things, fix things, invent things, or understand how anything works. I mean, there's an image of Kamala Harris holding an electric doodad next to the charging thing to an electric car, thinking that electrons are flowing through like gas in a gas tank. I mean, it is, these people are just incredibly stupid.
They are.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I have to admit, I believe that the government should have the best interest of America at heart. So I'm not a pure libertarian, but I have to admit, I'm not against capitalism or free enterprise. No. I think it's really prospered the country, really having.
Look, I have known some complete horrible people who have gotten rich. I've known very good people who have gotten rich. I've known assholes who have done. I mean, morality in business it just doesn't work the way people think. Good people don't always prosper, and bad people sometimes prosper. But all that stuff gets figured out in the end. It does kind of even out in the long run. And I think I'm much more trustworthy of the guy who runs my local hardware store than I am some government regulator who is trying to tell him how to run his hardware store.
I got my hair cut today, and I was in this lady, she owns the place, and she was bitching about the city of Fayetteville. They have to assess the property they have for a tax, and it was some crazy thing that they had you have to lie on this form and this is a city official telling her this. It was just bizarre, and this is how government, when they have all these weird regulations that contradict each other, is. I agree with getting rid of those. So. Robert, if Reagan were president today, would he be on more Russia side, or would he view Putin like he viewed Gorbachev? Well, it was very interesting. Reagan, despite being had the rhetoric of the evil empire and being strong against communism, he actually reached out to a lot of people, not only the Soviet Union, but Iran. It ended up the Iran-Contra affair secretly. That was kind of a mess. But Reagan wasn't as hardline and as aggressive as people thought he would be. They thought he would start World War III. But I think he really appreciated diplomatic ties and tried to work things out peacefully. That was kind of my take. So I believe if he were president today, he would be working with Putin for some sort of settlement. That's just my take on that. What do you think?
Yeah, you remember, he got talked into putting the Marines in Lebanon as peacekeepers, and then the Marine
Yeah,
barracks got blown up, and he pulled them all out and said,
he did.
"We're not doing this anymore."
Right.
He had a very clear understanding of the limitations, and people in his name argued in favor of all these crazy wars, but I don't think Reagan would have supported any of this stuff because he would have looked at it and said, "Why? What's the point here?" Reagan was very much a nativist. He loved America. I mean,
He did.
the rest of the world just wasn't that interesting to him. America was
Mhm.
fascinating to him. That's really the difference. And that's a quality that Trump has. I think when Trump looks at Russia, he says, "Oh, it's a curious place." I think he likes their aesthetic, really. I mean, I think that's
Mhm.
really what it gets down to because Russian aesthetics, it's gaudy. Trump has
It's like Trump. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. He has the taste of a Russian gangster. I mean, that's,
Yeah,
he
but
would have
I see that. And Reagan almost had the taste of not that he was, but he almost liked the cowboy aesthetic. Reagan,
yeah. I
he
mean,
really did, and that was also a criticism against Reagan. Oh, he's just this cowboy that's on the loose, which I don't think that was a bad thing. But he had a ranch. He liked to ride horses, and he starred in cowboy movies, and that was a big thing back then. The westerns that kind of defined the American spirit, and Reagan really bought into that
Yeah,
feel.
he did. Yeah, I mean, he loved America, and
Mhm.
I think his interest in the rest of the world was a necessary thing. It was a requirement of the job, but that was as far as it went. Because when he was a younger man, he didn't go like touring around the world or anything. He never tried to do those things. He
Mhm.
was a guy who, I mean, he didn't travel other than in America. He loved America, and I mean, that's something we've lost in a way. We don't love our country as much as we used to, and really in the 80s, we really kind of fell back in love with how great
Yes.
America was.
And I think people like that about Reagan. Again, that's that positive view that really people picked up on. And I think that is important. Joseph, $3. Thank you, Joseph. Did Reagan have a cult following the way Trump sometimes seems today? Could people on the right criticize Reagan like they should criticize Donald Trump too? How much of a cult leader was Reagan to the Republicans back in the 1980s? That's a good question because there's some criticism. Some people are just blind, Trump followers, no matter what he does. I've never been in that camp. I like Trump, but I criticize him. Uh, it's a different era then because we didn't have social media. And that
Yeah,
really changed everything. So it's hard to gauge it. But Reagan had a lot of opposition, even from the Republican Party. But the thing is, Reagan became so damn popular by 1984, and most of politicians, they don't like to go against someone that's popular. So they kind of fell in line. So I don't remember a lot of Republican pushback by the mid 80s because Reagan was such a popular figure across America. But before he was elected in 1980, he had a lot of critics. He was considered too extreme, and there's a lot of people were opposed to Reagan.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
never got
There
the
were
cult
critics.
thing from him. The cult thing almost happened after now
Yeah,
with
yeah. I think you're right about that. The romanticism of the Reagan years and all that. And see, the problem is I was really too young then to really appreciate whether there was a cult. I didn't really understand how to see it. But you know what? I think a lot of it's the social media too. I mean, people communicate. You talk to a normal Trump supporter in real life, they're quite reasonable. But I bet you
yeah,
their online persona is completely batshit crazy.
yeah,
You know what I
yeah.
mean? That's just we play characters online. It's not
We
really
do.
who we are.
Yeah, and see, during the Reagan era, we didn't have online, and you just had the television stations. I guess the best you could do was call into a radio show or something. I mean, or letter to the editor. Remember those? So it was you didn't really know. So I think Reagan was popular, but I don't think there was the crazy cult following with him back then. At least I didn't pick it up at the time. And he was hated by the left. A lot of the left hated him. They called the homeless the Reagan homeless. They called it, and what else? They called it Reaganomics, trickle down, and all that type of stuff. So he definitely had a lot of enemies on the Democrat side. That's for sure. Steve Campbell, and keep your questions coming in. We'll keep answering them as long as it keeps coming in. We appreciate the support. Again, I split all the money with Z-Man, and it helps us continue. Steve Campbell, $10. There's a few of our guys on our side who I love to watch. However, the Wednesday wrap up is just not a duo of creators I enjoy, but it's really high quality, well-oiled machine. It's just simply good content. Well, that's really nice. That's because Z-Man and I, throughout the work, we get together and we practice our script for the show. And we don't do that at all. We just show up like 5 minutes before. And actually, Z-Man, it was his idea. All right, I guess you got it from a suggestion. Let's do Reagan. And I really do like, because our first show was like current events, but I do a daily current event show, and I know you write about current events. And sometimes it's good to go over topics like we're doing now, and I think it's a little bit more interesting. So, but thank you, Stephen, for that. I really do appreciate your support. That means a lot. Thank you.
I suspect there might be a niche audience or an audience for Gen X guys thinking back about what it was like to be a Gen X guy. Because, there's no there was never an 80s show. There was a 70s show. And a 60s shows, shows about the 60s, 50s. Pop culture kind of skipped the 80s and the early 90s in a lot of ways. And so, there might be an untapped audience for two soon-to-be geezers talking about the old days.
Yeah, and because a lot of these people, I've said, I felt old a year or two ago. I was talking to this one girl we knew in real life. She wasn't political or anything. And she wasn't even alive during 9/11. And I was like, wow, you know what I mean? So to her, it'd be like me thinking about Pearl Harbor, right? It's like, I wasn't even there. And so I really felt old then. But so I can remember, especially the 80s, I remember well, because again, I graduated high school in 1981. So I started my young adulthood, and I voted for Reagan in 84, and I did follow politics. So I am quite familiar with Reagan. 70s, I was more of a younger kid, so it's a little more fuzzy. But since the 80s, I can remember the times and what people thought and how it was portrayed. And
my recollection of the 70s is mostly about reruns of Gilligan's Island, Star Trek, that kind of stuff. The days of 3 TV channels, and what was it? Was it VHS or is it VHS, right? Or UHF? What the hell was it?
Oh yeah, it was
all channels, where they played like reruns and stuff.
Yeah, I always tease Sasha, and she always elbows me because I said, "Oh, let's go into Best Buy," and I want to ask them to see. I want to look at their color TVs. That's what I want to ask them. Because back then we had a black and white TV in our kitchen, and a lot of people, antennas. You remember the rabbit ears?
Yeah. I mean, to watch a football game always involved my father on the roof.
Yeah, that's right. You had to try to do that. You had the snow. I remember that. You had to try to get it in just perfectly. Yeah. That's the good old days. And we didn't have the ability to block people on the phone. To block someone, you just took the phone off the hook. That's how you did it. So it's changed a lot. And let me just see. Well, thank you guys for the very nice comments. And thank you guys for all your support. That looks like we got everything. We went a little bit over, but that was good. We got a lot of good super chats and support. And thank you. You guys support this. We will be back next week. We will announce what the topic is. I have no idea. So if you guys have suggestions, just send it to us, and maybe we'll pick it up like we did the Reagan one. That'd be cool. So.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. Because a lot of times people actually have very good ideas about. Yeah. I get them all the time. I mean, I actually, I get them through the email all the time about podcast or column or something, and it's very helpful.
Yeah, that would be good. So we love to talk about this stuff. And again, thank you guys. This is one of my favorite shows of the week, and I appreciate it. And thank you, Z-Man. And I have 1,000 people here online right now. So thank you guys all for watching. And we will see you next Wednesday. So talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.